You grew up watching tutorials before you were old enough to need them. You learned about skincare routines, about undertones, about the difference between skin types and product formulations, not from your mother standing at her bathroom mirror, not from a magazine you found somewhere, but from a screen, from strangers who spoke to you directly, who made it feel personal and accessible and completely normal to care this much this early about the surface you live in. By the time most previous generations were just beginning to figure out who they were, you already had a vocabulary for it. You already had aesthetics. You already had a version of yourself saved in a folder somewhere, a collection of images that showed the person you were trying to become before you had fully become anyone at all. This is where it starts. And it is genuinely different from anything that came before. Your mother's generation learned beauty from scarcity, from a handful of magazines, a few televised images, the women in their immediate lives. The reference points were limited, which meant the pressure, while real, was at least finite. There were only so many versions of beautiful to measure yourself against. Your grandmother's generation learned it even more locally, from community, from tradition, from what the women around her did and passed down without much question. Beauty was simpler then, not because women were less complex, but because the mirror they were handed was smaller. You were handed something else entirely. You were handed an infinite mirror, one that refreshed constantly, that showed you every possible version of feminine beauty simultaneously, that offered not one ideal, but thousands of competing ones, each with its own devoted community, its own language, its own aesthetic logic. Clean girl, dark academia, coastal grandmother, mob wife, that girl, soft life. Each one a complete visual identity you could try on, inhabit for a season, and replace when it stopped feeling true. No previous generation has ever had access to this kind of choice, and no previous generation has ever had to carry the psychological weight of it. Because here is what the infinite mirror does that the small one never did. It makes you aware at all times that you are constructing yourself, that your appearance is not just something that happens to you, but something you are actively producing, curating, deciding. Previous generations could participate in beauty culture without necessarily feeling like authors of it. You don't have that distance. You know too much about the process, the filters, the lighting, the angles, the editing, the gap between the image and the reality behind it. You grew up fluent in the language of construction, which means you can never fully unsee it, not even when you're looking at yourself. This creates something that older generations often misread as vanity or obsession. What it actually is hyper-awareness. You think about your appearance with a level of consciousness and complexity that previous generations simply didn't have the framework for. You consider not just how you look, but what your look communicates, what aesthetic it belongs to, whether it reflects who you actually are or who you were last month, whether it's authentic or performative, and whether that distinction even means anything anymore. These are not superficial questions. They are identity questions. And you are asking them through the language of beauty because that is the language you were given. What makes your generation genuinely different is not that you care more about beauty. Women have always cared. What's different is that you refuse to pretend it's simple. You hold the contradiction openly, the awareness that beauty standards are constructed and often harmful, sitting directly alongside the genuine pleasure you take in skincare, in makeup, in finding a fragrance that feels like yours, in building a personal aesthetic that communicates something true about who you are. You don't resolve that contradiction, you live inside it. More honestly than any generation before you has been willing to. There's also a relationship with self-care that your generation has reframed in ways that are still being understood. For older generations, skincare and beauty rituals were often primarily about output, about the result, about how you appeared to others, about maintenance and presentation. You brought something different to it. You brought interiority. The night routine became about nervous system regulation. The makeup became about creative expression. The fragrance became about identity construction. The whole apparatus of beauty shifted in your hands from something you did for the world to something you did for yourself, with the world as a secondary audience at most. This is not a small shift. This is a fundamental reorientation of what beauty culture is actually for. And yet, underneath all of that awareness, all of that fluency, all of that conscious self construction, there is something quieter and more vulnerable that doesn't get talked about enough. You are the first generation to have grown up being perceived at scale before you knew who you were. The images, the aesthetics, the curated versions of yourself that you put into the world as a teenager, they existed publicly, permanently, before your identity had finished forming. You were seen before you were ready. And some part of you has been trying to catch up ever since, trying to build an interior self that is as developed as the exterior one you learned to present so early. Trying to figure out which version of yourself is the real one and which ones were aesthetics you were trying on in a dressing room that turned out to have no walls. This is the wound underneath the fluency, the exhaustion of having been performing self construction for so long that you sometimes can't locate the self that exists before the construction begins. The specific anxiety of a generation that knows too much about image making to ever feel completely natural inside an image, including their own. But here is what is also true. Your generation brought honesty to beauty culture that it desperately needed. You talked about the gap between the filtered image and the real face. You showed the texture and the asymmetry and the days when nothing feels right. You built communities around the idea that beauty is a practice and a pleasure and sometimes a coping mechanism and not a moral achievement. You made it acceptable to care deeply about how you look and to simultaneously question every system that tells you how you should. That combination, deep engagement plus critical awareness, is something no previous generation managed with quite the same fluency. You see beauty differently because you grew up seeing everything differently through a screen that showed you the artifice and the desire simultaneously. That gave you the tools to construct yourself and the awareness that construction was happening. That handed you an infinite mirror and asked you to find yourself in it. And somehow, in the middle of all of that noise, you are still trying, still reaching for the version of yourself that feels true, still building rituals that belong to you, still finding the fragrance that feels like yours, still putting on something in the morning that makes you feel like you showed up as yourself today. That search is not confusion. That is your generation's particular and serious form of courage.